Alright, I usually don't do disclaimers like this because I don't give a fuck if you get offended or not, but I kinda feel obliged to because today's episode of Three Kingdoms Month has to do with some very taboo topics. So if things like doing unspeakable acts to dead bodies makes you uncomfortable, don't say I didn't warn you. The Three Kingdoms period has no shortage of memorable characters. Noble heroes and menacing villains fill the ranks of this historical era and one of the bloodiest periods in ancient history. It's a story that has inspired everything from video games to movies to Game of Thrones. Seriously, watch the Battle of Blackwater and tell me that isn't literally the Battle of Red Cliff. In fact, I think that Game of Thrones comparison is a pretty fair one. You know how there's some screwed up crap in Game of Thrones? Don't worry, no spoilers, but trust me, if you know, you know. Well, turns out the Three Kingdoms period wasn't exactly a family-friendly period in history either. Everything from incest to pedophilia to cannibalism to alcohol abuse can be found in the historical records. Naturally, some of what is taboo today was seen in a different light back then. But I think we can all agree that something like Zhang Fei abducting a 13-year-old girl, collecting sticks in the woods, and making her his wife is kind of fucked up no matter which way you slice it. I mean, what are you supposed to even do in that situation anyway? When Zhang Fei says you're his wife, you don't really have a choice in the matter, especially in ancient China, especially if you're a 13-year-old kid. But it doesn't make it okay. And it raises a question. How well do you think you know your favorite Three Kingdoms characters? Because I can assure you that no one is actually as perfect as we make them out to be. Take for instance our gallant hero, star of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Liu Bei. Liu Bei was a man of the people. He was beloved by the commoners because he was a commoner himself. The first emperor of Shu, coincidentally with a pun that works only in English, had his first job making shoes. But he gave up the sandal-making life to go play warlord when the chaotic climate of the Yellow Turban Rebellion opened the floodgates for almost 100 years of civil war. Liu Bei had two best friends, a drunken butcher named Zhang Fei, who had a thing for little girls lost in the woods, and Quan, who was a criminal on the run for killing a guy in his hometown. Together, they swore an oath of brotherhood to put down the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and then just kinda go where the wind took them after that. They really didn't have a plan in place at first. Eventually, Liu Bei found himself the administrator of Shu province after the death of Tao Qian. Everything went smoothly for a little bit until a homeless Liu Bu showed up with his army looking for a place to stay. In his infinite wisdom, Liu Bei decided to do just that, despite the fact that Liu Bu had a history of betraying quite literally everyone who ever did anything for him ever, and was well known by this point in time too. Hell, he'd probably betray himself if the opportunity ever arose. This situation went as you would expect. Liu Bu staged a little coup in Shu province while Liu Bei was away, doing his whole man of the people and vassal of the Han shtick, and took control of Shu. Liu Bei also left his drunkard of a brother to protect the place, so naturally Liu Bu didn't have too hard of a time taking over either. Anyway, as upset as Liu Bei was, he was still benevolent and righteous and was determined to make this abusive relationship work. So he and his followers became subservient to Liu Bu, who is now the top guy in Shu. This lasted for only a few months before Liu Bei wanted to get his lands back. So he and his sworn brothers and the few loyalists he had left set out without any kind of plan to get his territory back. Eventually they ran out of supplies and had to resort to begging. This is when things get interesting. The people loved Liu Bei and were really eager to help him out. One such standout individual was Liu An, a hunter with no relation to our hero. Liu An was actually a big fan of Liu Bei and invited him to dinner at his house, promising a delicious feast of the best of the local game. And he could even bring friends if he wanted. Liu Bei agreed. A nice dinner, a warm house, what's not to love? That night, Liu An presented Liu Bei with probably the most succulent and juicy dish he ever had in his life. Liu Bei asked what kind of meat it was, and Liu An told him, wolf. Here's your pro tip of the day. If someone ever offers you mystery meat, well, number one, you probably shouldn't eat it unless you know what it is. Number two, if you do eat it, you really should never ask what it is. Anyway, the following day, Liu Bei went to fetch his horse in the stables to leave Liu An's house, and that's when he saw it. On a table, in the stables, was the decaying body of a young woman, her arm severed at the joint. Liu Bei paused for a second and asked, "What the actual fuck?" Or essentially the ancient Chinese equivalent. It turns out this lady was Liu An's wife. Liu An, despite being a magnificent hunter, couldn't even catch a deer or a rabbit to feed his guest. So in his desperation to not look like a big failure in front of his idol, he murdered his wife and fed her to Liu Bei. Liu Bei began to cry. A reasonable response to the realization that you just unwittingly committed cannibalism and provided the excuse a deranged psychopath needed to kill his wife, I'm sure. Except, Liu Bei wasn't sad about any of that. Instead, he grabbed Liu An in a big, warm hug and thanked him profusely for sacrificing so much to help him out in a jam. He even invited Liu An to come with him, but he declined, and his excuse was, "My mother is still alive, so I can't go." Anybody else getting like a Norman Bates vibe? Now here's the thing, this story is actually not true. Kind of. There's no record of Liu Bei's encounter with Liu An outside of the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, so we can pretty much assume this story is fictional. However, Liu Bei did actually commit cannibalism at roughly the same point in time. In actuality, just after Lu Bu took control of Shu while Liu Bei was in the field, Liu Bei led a beleaguered force to oppose him. The only problem is that his army was low on supplies to start, and now he was caught between Yuan Shu, who he was just fighting, and Lu Bu. Things got so bad that Liu Bei's army did start resorting to eating the dead to stay alive. Naturally, one can only eat so much long pork before they start to break down and try to find some way out of the situation, or at least I hope. So Liu Bei surrendered to Lu Bu and joined his ranks for a brief period of time. That's the truth around the matter. Sometimes the truth is a little stranger than fiction, as they say. This tends to be the case, because unlike this story, the rest of this episode is going to be true stories about some of the most prominent men in the era, drawn from official biographies. As some of you probably know, Liu Bei eventually became one of the three rulers of the Three Kingdoms. In his case, the Emperor of Shu. But he wasn't the only emperor that was a bit weird or had a weird past. We need look no further than the Emperor of Wei, Cao Pi. That's right, Cao Pi was the first emperor of Wei, not Cao Cao. Common confusion. It's kind of a Julius Caesar thing. He was never emperor either, in case you didn't know. Cao Pi was an interesting individual. First off, he was incredibly smart and talented, even when he was a young child. According to his own autobiography, he touts just how much of an ancient Chinese Chad he was. At the age of 5, he learned to ride full-grown horses. At the age of 8, he could hit any target from horseback with pinpoint precision. By the age of 12, he was already a master of literary classics and was writing his first poems. In his youth, he was ambidextrous, and that was put to good use as he learned to master swordsmanship, including fighting with 2 weapons at once, and he was able to beat just about anyone, even when he was drunk off his ass. He was like an ancient Chinese Kim Jong-un, if you want to believe the propaganda. But that's only cursory information. At the end of the day, Cao Pi was a harsh ruler at times, but more often than not, he worked his fingers to the bone to make sure his state ran smoothly and efficiently. And if you think that means Cao Pi had no free time, actually no, he had tons of it. He actually wrote several books, including collections of poems, treatises on other classical works, and one of the world's first books on literary criticism. Quite the accomplished man after all. However, he also wrote another one of the world's first books on a particular subject: ghost stories. Cao Pi wrote at least one horror anthology, which translates from Chinese as Ghost Stories by Cao Pi. I guess titles weren't his strong suit when it came to writing. He may have written a second book too, but that one's a bit debatable. See, the thing about Cao Pi is that he was infatuated with the supernatural and the occult. He absolutely loved ghosts, for one thing. He loved to talk about them and hear stories about them. In fact, one time, a government official named Zhong Yao took some unscheduled time off for a couple of weeks. When Cao Pi wanted to know what the deal is, Zhang Yao told him the truth, as recorded in his official biography. Zhang Yao's house was haunted by the ghost of a beautiful woman who seduced him and they slept together. However, as the weeks went on, Zhang learned that the woman was actually a demon and needed to be driven from his house. So naturally, like any episode of insert paranormal reenactment show here, Zhang Yao had to fight to get his home back from her. Realistically, if you were emperor, you would look this guy in the eye, smirk, and say, "What a crock of shit," and then have him instantly beheaded. But no, not Cao Pi. Cao Pi ate that shit up. He loved it. He probably asked Zhang to tell it again. Cao Pi spared Zhang, gave him an apology, and sent him on his merry way. Cao Pi may have been a little jealous, too. You see, Cao Pi was a practicing Taoist back in ancient China. Taoism during the Three Kingdoms period was quite different than Taoism of later dynasties in modern day. It was a relatively young religion, and it was prone to being associated and mixed with the occult. There were all sorts of bizarre rituals one could undertake to extend their life and reinvigorate their life force. And Cao Pi tried a lot of them, but he was very fond of Taoist sex rituals. One of the many teachings of these rituals was that one could live longer by withholding ejaculation and instead experiencing orgasm in other parts of the body. And you bet Cao Pi certainly practiced this too. So not only was this Chad Emperor good at virtually everything he ever did according to his autobiography, but he also probably lasted way longer than you in the sack. But on a side note, studies have shown that men who don't ejaculate semi-frequently have an increased risk of prostate cancer. And Cao Pi died mysteriously young at the age of 39. That was young back then for an emperor, especially one who had total control of his court. Now, I'm not saying Cao Pi died of prostate cancer, oh no, but I do think maybe some of them sex rituals may have backfired when it came to extending his life. Speaking of backfiring, let's pivot over to the Emperor of Wu, Sun Quan. I think anyone with a heart can agree that Sun Quan had a difficult life. His father died when he was only 9 years old. He spent the majority of his youth as a political prisoner of Yuan Shu, and he nearly died on his first campaign from a bandit attack when his older brother Sun Ce conquered Wu. Sun Ce was assassinated shortly after, leaving Sun Quan to inherit the unstable kingdom of Wu at only the age of 18. He ruled it for 53 years, and in that time he had no shortage of great successes, but also great failures. Fast forward to the year 230, with the Three Kingdoms period in full swing, and Sun Quan found himself in a dilemma. Cao Rui, who succeeded his father Cao Pi, was expanding his influence northward, into the steppes and Korea. Liu Shan and his boys in Shu, when they weren't throwing failed assault after failed assault at the Wei border, were expanding their influence eastward and south into Indochina. And since Sun Quan and Shu weren't exactly the best of friends anymore, he knew he had to expand too. Except here's the problem. Unlike the other two kingdoms, Wu was very much surrounded by water and didn't really have any major opportunities to expand. Sun Quan pushed into Vietnam but was beaten back by locals a few years later. So naturally, Sun Quan realized that the only way he could increase his territory without taking it from Shu and Wei was to sail into the seas for new lands. There were two islands Sun Quan was very interested in, legendary islands that he knew if he were to possess Liu Shan and Cao Rui, those two youngsters would have no choice but to take him seriously now. These islands are called Yizhou and Danzhou. The only problem about Yizhou and Danzhou is that no one knew for sure if they actually existed. No one had ever actually found them or been to them. But to Sun Quan, what would be impossible for other men would be a cakewalk for his retainers. So Sun Quan commissioned his officers Wei Wen and Zhuge Ji to set sails on the sea in search of legendary islands along with 10,000 men. To put things in perspective here, this is kind of like Rome sending two generals into the Atlantic to search for Atlantis. Naturally, all of Sun Quan's advisors advised against this, but Sun Quan knew in his heart that the islands of Yizhou and Danzhou were real, and these mystical islands would belong to the Kingdom of Wu. As you can probably guess, this expedition went pretty poorly. Wei Wen and Zhuge Ji spent about a year at sea, lost almost all their crew to illness, and decided to return home. On their way, they realized, well, they just can't show back up in court empty-handed. That would be improper. So they made a pit stop in Taiwan, which they knew existed, picked up a few thousand aborigines, and returned to Wu with them as slaves. Sun Quan was a little upset. Actually, he was rather livid. How dare Wei Wen and Zhuge Ji fail to find these mythical islands that no one is sure they even exist after literally everyone in my court told me it was a bad idea and I went through with it anyway, he thought. So he had Wei Wen and Zhuge Ji executed. With blunders like that under his belt, it's probably no surprise that Sun Quan and the Kingdom of Wu didn't win in the Three Kingdoms period. Actually, of the Three Kingdoms, none of them won in the end. The real victor was the Jin Dynasty, officially formed by Sima Gan in 265, but the roots can be found in the decaying Cao Wei 20 years earlier. In the early days of the Wei Dynasty, there was a brilliant strategist and politician named Sima Yi. Sima Yi wasn't the best at anything, but he also wasn't exactly bad at anything. This is exactly the kind of guy you want by your side when you're in control, and exactly the kind of guy you should be afraid of when control of your country is slipping out of your hands. And Sima Yi proved that to be true when he threw a coup d'etat with the aid of his sons. He didn't overthrow the Wei dynasty, instead he kinda just showed them who was really in charge here. There's a lot to talk about with Sima Yi and his sons, but all things considered, with a lot of the other people during this time, they were comparatively normal. Sure, Sima Yi could apparently turn his head around 180 degrees like something out of The Exorcist. Sima Shi might have poisoned his wife, and Sima Zhao just flat out said fuck it and killed the emperor at one point, but other than that, they're pretty tame. Sima Yi had 11 kids, all together with various wives, but only one of them turned out to be a little weird. Sorry, did I say a little? I meant a lot. Like really, really weird. Sima Gan was the third son of Sima Yi and his wife Zhang Chunhua. He was kept out of court politics and military affairs for most of his young life, not because he was inept at them, though he certainly was, but more because he just could not be bothered with them. You see, Sima Gan was certainly eccentric. He liked to just sit for days in his manor and never leave the house. When visitors would arrive, on the rare occasion he decided to speak to them, he would speak to them through a closed door or gate. When he did leave his house, it was usually to ride his chariot in the dead of night around the city and the wilderness. On the rare occasion he would visit his relative Sima Jiang, Sima Gan sure knew how to make himself at home. He would lie on Sima Jiang's bed and refuse to move so that Sima Jiang could sit down. When out on his chariot adventures, no one exactly knew where the man went or what he did. Usually he was gone all night long and would arrive back home shortly before dawn. He would never talk about anything that happened. He even went on adventures in the rain. A little water wasn't going to stop Sima Gan, oh no. He welcomed it. To quote a soaked Sima Gan in an uncovered chariot, "The outside should be like the inside." Sima Gan was really into hoarding things too, but not because he liked to collect them and look at them. Usually he just couldn't be bothered to get rid of them. Because he was in a very important family, he would frequently get gifts of rare silks and cloths and tapestries for his manor, but wouldn't do anything with them. Instead, he piled them in a room and just let them sit there while they rotted away. And here's where it gets gross. Like many nobles back then, Sima Gan had no shortage of concubines, and he was into kinky things, much like Cao Pi. Except while Cao Pi was just a touch perverted, but wasn't really doing anything horribly taboo, at least that we know of, Sima Gan was. You see, concubines tended to die young for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they fell ill, sometimes they fell down a flight of stairs. Now, you know how Sima Gan liked to pile up organic materials in his house and not do anything with them? Well, he did that with his concubines too, and would only bury them when they started to really decay. But it gets worse. In Sima Gan's mind, a concubine is a concubine. So what if she ain't moving no more? So Sima Gan often engaged in necrophilia with his dead concubines. As far as we know, he didn't eat them. At least, not in the traditional sense. So one has to wonder, what was Sima Gan doing on his chariot rides that he never told anyone about? And you thought Zhang Fei abducting a little girl in the woods was bad. Jeez. So thankfully for us, Sima Gan was so weird and screwed up that history has kindly forgotten about him, and he almost never shows up in any Three Kingdoms adaptation in any major way. And that is where we'll end it for now. Hopefully I didn't scar you too much with some of the stories in here. I know they were certainly a little out there, especially that last one. If there's any interest, I'd be willing to tell more silly stories in the future about the Three Kingdoms period, because believe me, there's no shortage of these things, whether it be from the novel or the annals of history. And be sure to check back for the finale of Three Kingdoms Month, where we'll be checking out only some of the many Three Kingdoms video games out there. And I need to stress some on that one, because next episode had so many technical difficulties going into making it. I don't even know what I'm gonna do and if I should even release what I'm gonna end up with. I've had so many games that don't work, refuse to be recorded properly, games I can't even find or get my hands on, so you might just be stuck looking at Dynasty Warriors and that's it. Wish me luck on that last one. I'm gonna try to have it out before Thursday when Total War comes out, so bear with me here, and then obviously after that, Total War is gonna be out. I'm taking at least a week break. I want to take time to play the game, enjoy the game. Then, you know, all the footage I'll gather during that week and a half is going to come back for a full review where I'm going to go into detail about what works in the game, what doesn't work in the game. You know, the whole shebang that I kind of did with my MK review. Although hopefully I won't be nearly as frustrated and angry. Hopefully 3 Kingdoms Total War makes me smile at the end of the day. I have actually a sneaking suspicion it will. And I'm very excited, actually. So, yeah. 3 Kingdoms a month, baby. Coming to an end. Stay tuned.